Have you ever felt like your life was already written by someone else, somewhere else? Like no matter how hard you tried, you were just playing out a script that didn't belong to you? If you've ever felt erased, out of place, or terrified of being truly seen, this story was written for you. They said I was born quiet, but that's not true. I was born knowing. That's different. There's a kind of silence that comes from peace. And then there's the silence that comes from knowledge too heavy for a child's mouth to carry. Mine was the second kind. I knew how my life would end before I knew how to lie about it. Every year, like clockwork, the night before my birthday, it came again. That vision, a room that smelled like bleach and melted plastic. Fluorescent lights coughing above me, my skin is pale and damp, like paper left too long in the rain. My name, half-spoken, clipped, mispronounced, by people who shouldn't have been there, people who looked at me like I was the footnote to someone else's tragedy. The ending never changed. No matter what I did, I could change cities, countries, and hair colors. I could cut people off mid-sentence and refuse to let them love me. But the vision waited, like a bookmarked page in a book someone else wrote. When I was 11, I tried to stop it. I read every folk cure I could find, slept under mirrors, burned sage, buried a lock of my hair under moonlight. I made bargains with shadows and whispered promises to nothing. But when I turned 12, it returned. Sharper, more vivid. My body looked older in the vision now, almost real. At 13, I asked a teacher if people could live lives out of order, and she laughed like I'd said something precious and impossible. Stopped asking questions after that. By 14, I stopped trying to fight the ending. Instead, I began undoing the beginning. I dropped clubs, quit ballet. I stopped taking the bus with friends who asked too many questions. I erased myself in small pieces until even I wasn't sure where the version of me that was supposed to live had gone. I told myself it was a strategy, that if the story had already been written, I could still change the sequence. Maybe even change the meaning. And so at 17, the night before the birthday that was supposed to mean adulthood, I sat in my room waiting for the vision to come. And it did. The walls of the hospital were the same off-white color. The lights flickered in that staccato rhythm. My limbs were thinner, more breakable. My mouth tried to say something, but the words didn't come. And the strangers, those faceless shadows in medical coats, leaned in and said a name that was almost mine, but not quite. I watched it play like a film I'd memorized. When I woke, my pillow was wet from sweat, my chest hollow from a scream I hadn't let out. That morning, I received an email. A scholarship I had worked 2 years ahead to qualify for, offered. Full ride. Applause in the living room. My aunt's eyes were shining with the kind of pride I had stopped believing I could earn. I smiled, nodded, said thank you. Then I declined it, just like that. Deleted the acceptance letter, blocked the contact. They said I was being self-destructive. I wanted to say I was being strategic. Because here's the truth, I didn't want to live forward. Living forward meant moving closer to the end. Living backward meant I could dismantle the inevitability, piece by piece, like disassembling a machine so it could no longer function. I took the acceptance day and made it my resignation. I told the boy who always walked me home that we shouldn't speak anymore, and I did it with no explanation. I saw the confusion in his face, the half-formed protest. He would have said something beautiful. I didn't let him. Because love meant roots. And roots meant timelines. By the end of that week, I was on a train to a university I had no business being in. I forged my way into an audit list for a graduate lecture on nonlinear cognition. I wore dark clothes, said little, and listened like my life depended on it. Because it did. I stayed after class, asked better questions than I had answers for. The professor assumed I was a visiting scholar. I didn't correct him. When someone asked where I'd published, I recited journals I'd memorized but never submitted to. No one fact-checked brilliance. Not when it wore confidence like perfume. 3 months later, I stood behind a podium at a cognitive science conference in Belgium, presenting a 10-minute speech on narrative distortion in trauma recall. I wasn't old enough to book my own hotel room, but I spoke with the voice of someone who had already lived through too many endings. I remember the way the microphone hummed under my fingers, the way the lights blinded me just enough to keep the faces in the audience faceless. I introduced myself under a name that wasn't mine. Not legally, but it was the name I would have had if my mother hadn't left my father before I was born. It was the name that wasn't attached to hospital charts and childhood records. The name from a version of me that never existed. But it felt real when I said it, more real than the girl who used to flinch every time her birthday came close. I told them about memory loops and how trauma can fracture time, how some people remember pain before it happens, how others rehearse grief for years before loss arrives. I said, narrative is a lie we tell ourselves to survive. They nodded, scribbled notes, applauded. I bowed my head as if I were grateful, but I wasn't grateful. I was making my move, my first public lie carved into academic truth. They didn't know they were part of my rebellion, that I was unraveling fate in real time, syllable by syllable. When I left the stage, someone called after me. "You're remarkable," they said. I turned, smiled, tilted my head. I know. Because I wasn't remarkable. I was prepared. That's what they never understood. I didn't succeed by accident. I constructed every piece of my life out of sequence, like a story where the twist came before the setup. I was methodical. I was ruthless with time, because the moment I stopped believing the vision was a prophecy, I realized it was a blueprint, and blueprints can be redesigned. I took the train home that night and watched the cities blur past me like scenes from a film I wasn't in anymore. I felt lighter. Not free, never free, but lighter. Like I'd removed one stone from the pocket that always tried to drag me into the ocean. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and said my real name out loud, not the one I used for school or papers or rooms full of strangers, the one I hadn't heard since I was a girl, before the visions began. It sounded foreign, like someone else's dream. But I said it again, louder, because if they wrote the ending, I would rearrange the middle until it didn't make sense anymore, until they couldn't find me on the path they expected, until I was untraceable. I didn't become this way by accident. People like to romanticize broken girls who play with fire, call it trauma, call it artistry, call it brilliance wrapped in tragedy, but I was never anyone's beautiful ruin. I was an architect, calculated, designed to hold weight. My whole life was a blueprint designed to hold one simple truth. If I couldn't escape my ending, then I would dictate everything else. The middle, the shape, the sequence. So I made rules, not the kind that live in dusty notebooks or fridge magnets. These were etched into muscle memory, reflexive and brutal. Rule 1, never do what's expected when it's expected. Rule 2, no attachments. People with roots are easier to bury. Rule 3, never, ever admit what I see. It was that last one that taught me to keep my voice sharp and my expressions neutral. That made me the kind of girl people remembered without ever really knowing. I dated like a sociologist, studied relationships like systems to be tested. Dinners pre-logged in my calendar, text responses crafted like interview questions, and always, an expiration date set before anything could matter. I ended things mid-sentence, walked out mid-laugh. I knew the exact moment interest became vulnerable and I slipped away just before it happened. People called me unforgettable. I called it control. Jobs followed the same pattern. I stacked internships with fabricated recommendations, walked into research positions with forged credentials, outpaced my supervisors by pretending I'd already done what they were only beginning to imagine. I used the dissonance to my advantage. Being too young to belong anywhere made me invisible and impossible to discredit at the same time. Let them whisper. Let them doubt. Confusion was a shield. The fewer answers I gave, the more authority I gained. I curated mystery like a weapon. If they didn't know where I came from, they couldn't predict where I was going. But even the best-built scaffolding shakes sometimes. And for me, that moment came in the form of a subject line that should have been impossible. Panel invitation, entropy reversal, and temporal drift in narrative behavior. The sender wasn't anyone I knew personally, but I recognized the affiliation. The Entropy Symposium was an underground academic movement of physicists, linguists, and theorists who studied time not as chronology, But as behavior, I read the invitation twice, then a third time. It didn't make sense. They wanted me on a panel, no submission, no proposal, just my presence. I should have declined. I didn't. Because saying yes to the things that didn't make sense. That was my litmus test. If the story was already written, I'd only followed the chapters that weren't in the original draft. This felt like one of them, a glitch in the narrative, a door I hadn't seen before. Still, that didn't mean I wasn't scared. Scared that the rules I'd built were finally folding in on themselves. Scared that I was about to stand on a stage where I didn't belong. Not metaphorically, but literally. I had no degrees to my name, no institutional backing, just footnotes I'd hacked into journals and credentials I wore like stolen coats. But fear wasn't new to me. It was just another kind of silence I'd learned to walk through. The symposium was held in a former observatory. Half glass, half stone, perched high above the city like a sentinel. I wore black, of course, sleek, faceless. My hair pinned into a braid so tight it felt like a crown made of wire. I brought no slides, no notes, just my voice and the weight of 100 rehearsed lies that had become indistinguishable from truth. As I waited behind the curtain, I could hear the audience murmuring, names being whispered, credentials being recited like armor. I knew they'd wonder who I was. I wanted them to. I wanted them to look at me and see an anomaly. Because that's what I was. A disruption, a data point that didn't belong. When my name was announced, it wasn't the one I was born with. It wasn't even the one I used on paper. It was a name I made up 2 weeks prior, just in case I ever had to disappear. But I wore it like a second skin as I walked on stage, heels silent against the polished obsidian floor, lights blooming white-hot behind my eyes. The first question came like a test shot. Dr. Aves, your work proposes that memory follows emotional velocity rather than chronology. Can you explain the scientific basis for that claim? I smiled, slowly, not wide, just enough to unsettle. Emotion is the algorithm, I replied. Time is the result. Silence. Then a ripple of pens scratching paper. I could feel their discomfort, their curiosity. I let it stretch, let it build tension. This was the power of being unknowable, of being unreadable. If they couldn't trace me, they couldn't dismantle me. But beneath the calm, something else stirred. Something I didn't recognize at first. A flicker. A breath I hadn't planned for. Not fear, not pride. Something older. A memory, maybe. Of being 8 years old, staring at a birthday cake, and knowing I'd never get to wish for anything other than more time. The audience asked more questions. I answered them all, not with facts, but with conviction, because conviction can feel like truth when it's dressed in the right rhythm. I told them about patterns I hadn't studied, but lived, about dreams that weren't dreams, about how a girl who sees her own ending might choose to live backwards, not out of madness, but out of rebellion. They clapped when it ended. I didn't smile. I stepped down from the stage and let their confusion follow me like smoke. I didn't need their approval. I needed their uncertainty. Because uncertainty is the crack in the system. It's where change begins. Back in the quiet of the dressing room, I stared at my reflection. Not because I didn't recognize myself, but because for a moment, I did, fully. The eyes that never slept, the mouth that never confessed, the girl who broke her own rules just to see what would happen. And then I heard a voice behind me. Quiet. Careful. You don't have a doctorate. Not a question, a fact, spoken with the gentleness of a blade. I turned. There he was, the boy who would one day rewrite my ending with a question I couldn't prepare for. But that's another story. For now, I just stared back and said what I always said when the game tilted too close to the truth. Then I guess we're both pretending. I knew what he was before I knew his name. Some people move through space like punctuation, loud, declarative, interrupting the flow of a room with their presence. But he didn't do that. He slipped through moments like ellipses, like a question left unanswered on purpose. When he spoke, it was never to fill silence. It was to see what would emerge from it. And when our eyes met for the first time, backstage, right after my panel, he didn't smile. He observed, like I was a variable he hadn't yet placed on his graph. "Do you already know how this ends?" That was the first thing he ever said to me. Not, "Hello," not, "Your talk was fascinating," not even, "Your credentials don't check out," just that. My breath caught so sharply in my throat I thought I might choke on it. For a second, I wondered if someone had told him, if he knew what I was, what I saw, what I'd done to stay invisible. But he didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a mirror. "No," I lied, smoothing the tremor from my voice. "That would be boring." He tilted his head, not quite believing me, not quite calling me out. Then he walked away without another word, and somehow, that was worse than anything he could have said. His name was Dr. Rowan Ingram, a rising star in a field that hated stars. Theoretical neuropsychologist. Specialization, temporal perception in memory encoding. People whispered about him like he was a myth. Young, unreadable, with a reputation for dismantling research papers with a few gentle sentences that somehow felt like mercy and murder at once. He'd published work that contradicted long-held truths, and instead of being dismissed, he was lauded for it, not because he was right, but because he made being wrong look like an invitation. I told myself he was just a ripple in the timeline, an anomaly, a bump in my path. And then I kept running into him. The next time was at a lecture on recursive memory modeling. I arrived early. He was already there, sitting in the back row, black coat draped over one knee, notebook closed but untouched. When I passed him, he didn't speak, but his gaze followed me like a tether. After the lecture, we both lingered, too long, near the exits. We didn't speak, just stood in the same air exhaling questions neither of us were ready to voice. 2 days later, it was a cafe, one of those places that only exists for the people who never sleep. He was there again, eyes scanning an article I'd archived weeks before it had even gone live. I didn't mean to sit across from him. It just happened. He didn't look up right away. "You fake your credentials," he said, stirring his tea without tasting it. I didn't flinch. "You let people believe you're colder than you are." He smiled then, not with his mouth, with his eyes. It was sharp and slow and dangerous, like watching ice melt on a knife's edge. We stayed there for hours. I learned things without meaning to. His mother vanished when he was 6. No body, no letter, just a scrap of paper left tucked inside his picture book. Don't trust the mirror. It remembers things that never happened. He didn't bring it up like a tragedy. He brought it up like a theorem. "Sometimes I think she wasn't running away," he said, sipping from a cracked ceramic mug. "Sometimes I think she saw something, and leaving was the only way to interrupt it." I knew that logic too well. I'd spent my entire life leaving before I could be left. I wanted to tell him I understood, but I couldn't. Not without giving something away. So instead I asked, "What do you think she saw?" He looked at me then. Really looked. Something she wasn't supposed to. That night, I couldn't sleep. My visions didn't come, but something else did. An ache. Low and deep like a clock that forgot how to tick. In the following weeks, we became not close, exactly, but proximal. We haunted the same archives, dissected the same theories, orbited the same questions. And the thing about proximity is it betrays you. It erodes your edges, makes you reach for things before you remember why you shouldn't. I told myself he wasn't a person. He was data, a study, an equation to be solved and then shelved. But then came the archive night. We were both there again sifting through cases on preemptive grief theory. The building was quiet, all amber light and dust motes. He leaned too close while reading over my shoulder. I turned to tell him off. I don't know what changed in that second. Maybe it was the way the light caught the edge of his collarbone, or the smell of ink and sleep deprivation, or maybe it was just the exhaustion of pretending I wasn't already undone. I kissed him. No warning, no build-up, just a sharp, clean break in the fabric of the rules I'd sworn never to touch. His hand gripped the side of my neck. Not rough, not desperate, just steady. Certain. Like he'd been waiting, but he didn't deepen the kiss. He just held it, contained it. Like he knew if it went further, it would break something neither of us could name. When I pulled back, my heart was beating like it had just remembered it was alive. He whispered, "So, that's the beginning." I didn't know what he meant, not then, but I'd remember those words later, when everything else fell apart. I left without saying goodbye. Back in my apartment, I stared at my rule book, the one I kept in my head, written in scars and calculations, and I realized I had broken every rule that mattered. Rule 1, never follow a predictable rhythm. I kissed him in the most predictable moment of all. Rule 2, no attachments. He was already under my skin. Rule 3, never admit what I see. I hadn't yet, but I was close. Too close. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass of my window and watched the city below. The lights blurred like stars falling out of place. And somewhere deep in the pit of my ribs, I felt the story shift. The second I touched him, I lost my place in the story. The email came at 3:17 a.m., that hour when even the night feels like it's holding its breath. I stared at the glowing subject line: formal offer, temporal instability, grant selection. I didn't open it right away, just sat there in the cold light of my laptop, wrapped in a sweater that still smelled faintly of iron and espresso. My fingers hovered over the trackpad like touching it would activate a landmine. When I finally clicked, the world rearranged itself in a way I couldn't unsee. The offer was real, fully funded, prestigious, a panel of researchers I had studied but never met, offering me the lead role in a project centered on trauma, memory, and nonlinear identity formation. The proposal they referenced was mine, except I had never written it, not fully. I had pitched the idea half drunk at a networking event months ago, half as a dare, half as a test. I never followed up, I never submitted. But someone had been listening, and now they wanted to give me a lab, a team, a title, power. I should have felt victorious, should have laughed, danced, snapped a photo to immortalize the moment. Instead, I felt cold. Because at the bottom of the email, beneath the congratulations and funding structure, was the start date. The day. The one from the vision, the one etched into every iteration of my death. I had seen it every year since I was a child, a room soaked in quiet, the overhead lights flickering like dying stars. My limbs are heavy, breath slowing. The air is thick and sterile, like grief in plastic packaging, and the name tag on the table near me, blank, or maybe erased. By ending. It wasn't a metaphor anymore. It had coordinates. It was time. I closed the laptop with shaking hands. The sound echoed louder than I expected, like the universe punctuating the moment for me. Flash, the memory gripped me again, faster than breath, sharper than thought. White tile. A whimper caught in my throat. The bed beneath me is too clean, too still. My name was never spoken, just approximated. In the light, this time, I noticed something new. It wasn't just flickering. It was failing. As if whatever held the world together in that moment was unraveling, just like me. I stood up, paced the room like I could outrun what I saw. I opened my inbox. Then I closed it. I opened it again. I hovered over the email, finger trembling above the keyboard. Then I clicked delete. But it didn't go away. The invitation returned 2 hours later. We understand your hesitation, but the future has already included you. We're waiting. No signature, no title. Just inevitability, dressed up like opportunity. I wanted to scream. Instead, I pulled the blackout curtain shut and sat on the floor, back pressed against the wall, counting each breath like it might rewrite the clock. I knew what I should do: disappear, change my name again, flee to another institution under a pseudonym with just enough falsified papers to get by. I'd done it before, but this wasn't a school. It wasn't a panel. This was a beginning masquerading as an ending, and that was the problem. Rowan found me the next day, like he always did. Without being asked, without permission, like the universe had given him a key to the doors I kept sealed. I was in the stairwell of the research building, tracing the concrete walls with my fingertips like they could anchor me. The hum of fluorescent light above us sounded too familiar. Too much like the one from my vision. Too much like the one that flickered when I collapsed. He didn't say hello, just stood 2 steps below me, eyes scanning mine like he already knew what I was hiding. "You didn't answer the offer," he said softly. Stared at the wall. "Wasn't real. It was..." "It's wrong," I whispered. "It's out of sequence." "That's what makes it right for you." His voice was steady, neutral, but the words trembled in the air because we both knew what he was really asking. I turned to face him fully, the stairwell tight enough that I could feel his breath. "You've lived your whole life out of order," he said, voice lower now. "Why are you scared of a chapter you didn't write?" That stopped me. I wanted to snap back, to remind him that this was different, that it was death I was avoiding, not disappointment. That he didn't see what I saw, that he didn't feel it sinking into his skin every time a clock struck midnight on the day he was born. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I whispered the most honest sentence I'd spoken in years, because it's the only one I didn't choose. There was silence then, heavy, final, like the last note of a song no one claps for. He didn't offer comfort. "Didn't you reach for me?" He just nodded once, like someone sealing a door. I walked away. That night, I sat in my room for hours, the laptop open but untouched. I thought of the name tag in the vision. Blank. No one knew me, not really, not then. But this offer, it knew me. I knew what I was capable of before I proved it. I knew the paper I hadn't written, the thoughts I hadn't dared to publish. It knew the story before I told it. Maybe that meant it had already happened. Maybe saying yes was the final domino. Or maybe it was a chance to break the sequence. Maybe the vision wasn't a trap, it was a test. I placed my hand on the keyboard. One more breath. Then I clicked accept. I walked into the lab on the first day like I was walking into a grave I had dug myself. Not in fear, but with purpose. If this was the room where I died, then I would haunt it on my own terms. No white coats, no machines humming without knowing what they were listening for, just me, my voice, and the power of telling a story the way I wanted it told. The way it needed to be told. They called it a pilot study, but it felt more like a ritual. The room was wide, sterile in the way new places often are, untouched by failure yet, humming with skepticism. The walls were glass, transparent like they trusted themselves. I didn't. I saw too much reflected in their clean lines, saw the ghosts of the versions of me who had walked this path before, versions that never made it past the first paper, the first breath under flickering light. I stood at the center of the conference table. The lights above me buzzed faintly, as if remembering. I opened with a line I'd rehearsed, not in front of a mirror, but in a dream. "Prediction is not science," I said slowly. "It's storytelling dressed in numbers." Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Another scribbled something, the kind of scribble meant to discredit. I didn't blink. "We're not here to calculate what happens next. We're here to prove that what happens next can be rewritten." That was the moment the silence changed. We began collecting the narratives immediately. Not surveys, not checkboxes, real stories, raw, messy, timelines that unraveled like strings in the wind. Subjects who remembered grief before the loss, others who described peace before the violence that shattered it. One woman swore she forgave her sister a year before the betrayal even happened. Another man claimed he felt his child's absence before he knew she existed. I recorded them all. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct it. I let their contradictions breathe because I understood them. I was them. Rowan stayed beside me, always near, never in the way. His presence was a thread, stabilizing but taut. I could feel his eyes on me more often now, not just curious but concerned. He never said it aloud, but he was watching the cracks form. He knew I was pushing, too hard, too fast. I skipped meals, worked overnight, rewrote data structures by hand when the models failed to reflect what I knew was true. I wasn't chasing approval, I was racing the clock. My clock, the one no one else could see. I barely slept. My body protested in whispers, tremors in my fingers, ringing in my ears. But I ignored it. The closer I got to the vision's date, the more I could feel the story folding in on itself. I believed, somewhere deep, that if I could finish the study, if I could prove that memory and identity weren't bound by linear time, then I could fracture the one ending I had never written. But Rowan knew. He never asked directly, never forced me to speak. Instead, one evening, he handed me a black coffee with his usual silence and said, "You're not running this project. You're surviving it." I'm clinging to the edge of the cup and didn't respond. Not because I had nothing to say, because I couldn't say it without shattering the illusion I had built around myself like armor. That night, I stayed in the lab long after everyone left. The lights dimmed around 2 a.m., triggered by a timer I hadn't reprogrammed. I liked it that way. I liked the flickering. It reminded me of where I was headed, of what I was trying to interrupt. I reviewed the final subject's recording, her voice trembling but firm. "I knew he was gone before he even left," she said. "It was like my memory jumped ahead without asking." I paused the playback. The lights above me buzzed louder, a hum that became a vibration, a flicker that became a strobe. And then it happened. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with screaming or spectacle, just a slow, suffocating stillness, like the air had turned to liquid, and my body no longer knew how to swim in it. My knees buckled. The chair scraped against the floor. Paper scattered like feathers from a broken wing. Then darkness, bright and blooming behind my eyes, like a supernova written in reverse. I saw it all again. The vision. But this time, something cracked. The walls were no longer smooth. The tile had seams. The shadows had faces. Faces I recognized. The strangers were people I had spoken to, debated, doubted. The name tag on the table wasn't blank anymore. It had my name, not the false ones I'd used. Right? And then a voice. Low, shaking. "Say her name," Rowan whispered. And someone did. They said it right. For the first time in every version of this memory, someone said it like it mattered. I felt my fingers twitch. My chest shuddered like it had remembered how to breathe. I was still, but not gone. I was caught. Rowan's arms cradled me on the floor, his face hovering above mine, hair messy, eyes red. "You're not disappearing," he said, voice breaking. "You're just in between paragraphs." And in that suspended breath between collapse and return, I understood. This wasn't death. This was the rewrite. The system had glitched, and I was no longer following its script. I woke to the sound of nothing. Not a flat line, not a beeping monitor, not sterile footsteps or machines wheezing in rhythm, just stillness. A quiet so whole it felt like velvet pressed against my ears. My first instinct was panic. For 17 years I had prepared to wake up to death or the memory of it. But this silence was something else. Something I didn't know how to survive. My fingers moved first, then my eyes, slow and resistant, as if trying to protect me from what I might see. I wasn't in the lab, and I wasn't in the hospital I'd seen in every vision. I was in a room, filled with soft shadows and late afternoon sun, slanting through gauzy curtains like gold cut by breath. I knew this place. Rowan's apartment. Sparse, lived in, not curated for visitors, books in uneven stacks, a mug green on the floor beside the couch. The smell of ink, eucalyptus, and a kettle left too long on the stove. I sat up too fast. Pain spiked behind my eyes like glass blooming. My vision blurred, then cleared, and then I saw them. Pages. Everywhere. Taped to the walls, spread across the floor, my handwriting, my diagrams, my annotations, and at the center of it all, one title written in dark, furious scrawl. My throat tightened. The last thing I remembered was falling. No, fracturing. The vision collapsed around me like a film set catching fire. And Rowan, his arms around me, his voice pulled me back. "You're just in between paragraphs," he'd said. The door creaked, slow and careful. I didn't look. I didn't have to. "You're awake," Rowan said softly, like a question he didn't want answered. "How long?" My voice cracked. It felt unused, hollow. 3 days. I nodded, not because I understood, but because there was no other response. He walked to the edge of the room and sat on the floor across from me, as if putting himself at eye level might keep me from unraveling. His face was tired, unshaven. There were lines around his mouth I hadn't seen before. "You didn't die," he said, like it was both a miracle and an accusation. Then what did I do? He looked around the room, at the walls, the paper, me. "You bent it." I blinked. "The timeline," he continued. "The vision, death, whatever it wasn't fixed. You challenged it by refusing to move through it the way it demanded. You didn't run, you wrote through it." He leaned forward slightly, his voice a little more firm. "Ya made the story break." A sharp sound left me, a laugh or a sob, I couldn't tell. My hands trembled as I pressed my palms over my eyes. Everything in me was shaking. Not with fear, but with something older. Something I hadn't let myself feel since the first time I saw that hospital ceiling as a child. Early relief. It hit me like a wave, hot and endless, rolling over years of planning, resisting, rearranging. I cried, quietly at first, then fully. No shame, no edits, no performance. Just the sound of a girl who had spent her whole life preparing to vanish, realizing, for the first time, she might actually be allowed to exist. Rowan didn't interrupt. He didn't try to comfort me. He just stayed. When the tears slowed, I let my hands fall into my lap. My voice came out hoarse, but steady. "I wasn't dying in the vision," I whispered. "Not really." He didn't speak. He waited. I was disappearing. That was the difference. In every version of that memory, it wasn't pain I remembered. It was absent, a hollowing, a silence so deep it had shape. The name tag hadn't been blank because someone erased me. I had erased myself. To survive, to stay ahead, to remain untraceable, unreadable, unsinkable. I'd removed every version of me that had roots, that had love, that had a timeline, and in doing so, I'd written my own vanishing. Rowan's eyes softened, not with pity, but with understanding. "I want to stop running," I said, the words like a stone in my throat. He nodded once, then stay. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a command, it was an invitation. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to say yes. Not because I had to, because I could. I looked around at the pages, my work, my mind, my refusal to disappear, and I realized something else. The study wasn't just a rebellion against the ending, it was a resurrection of me, of the parts I buried under every new name, every falsified credential, every relationship I never let become real. I had always seen the blank name as a death sentence. But maybe it was just a draft. An empty space waiting for me to write myself back in. I lay back down, the pillow cool against my skin. The sun shifted across the wall like a silent metronome, steady and soft. And for the first time in 17 years, I didn't wait for the vision to return. Because this time, I had already lived past it. And I was still here. There are moments when silence becomes unbearable, not because it's empty, but because it's full. Full of the words you've locked behind your ribs, full of memories that pulse beneath your skin like old bruises, full of truths that ache like splinters you never dared to pull out. I had carried mine for 17 years, cradled them like weapons, worn them like armor, and now they sat in my mouth, too sharp to swallow, too sacred to keep. We were in Rowan's apartment, no lights on, just the city outside breathing through the curtains, shadows stretching across the floor like they were trying to listen, too. I didn't look at him when I began. I stared at my own hands. Fingers curled tight, the skin along my knuckles pale. "I need to tell you something," I said. My voice was thinner than I expected, like it had aged without me. He didn't interrupt. Just waited, steady and quiet, like he already knew this moment would come. "I see my death every year," I said. "The night before my birthday. Always the same vision. A hospital. A white room, flickering lights, my name, wrong or not said at all. I don't know if it's a prophecy or a metaphor or something else entirely, but it's never changed, not once. Until now." The air felt heavier after the words left me. Not dangerous, just full, like I had opened a door that had been locked from the inside for too long. I kept going, the words tumbling now. I built my whole life around it. Lived backward, out of order. Though if I rearranged everything, if I never followed the steps, they couldn't reach me. I've watched myself die more times than I've lived. That's why I left everyone. That's why I never stayed. Rowan sat still, hands folded in his lap. His face was unreadable, but not cold. "I never told anyone," I said. "Not even myself. Not really. I turned it into strategy, into brilliance, but it was fear. All of it. Just fear." He let the silence settle before he spoke. When he did, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "My mother disappeared when I was 6, he said. No one knew why. No suicide note, no warning. Just a note left inside my storybook. Don't trust the mirror. It remembers things that never happened." I looked at him then, breath caught. He met my eyes. For years I thought she died, or that she lost her mind. But now I wonder, maybe she saw too much. Maybe she didn't want to live a story that had already decided how it would end. Maybe she left before the ending caught her. We sat there, two ghosts who had refused to vanish, two survivors of different kinds of knowledge. And for the first time, I understood that this wasn't about death. It never had been. It was about authorship, about reclaiming the right to decide who we became. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. It would have been too small, too fragile, too earthly. What passed between us wasn't romance. It was a belief. And belief is heavier than love. The next day, I stood backstage at my final symposium. It was a packed auditorium, 300 scholars, postdocs, skeptics, and strangers. A younger version of me would have looked at them and counted how many I needed to fool, how many I needed to dazzle, to disappear. But I wasn't that girl anymore. My name was printed clearly on the screen behind me. My real name, not the one I had borrowed, not the one I had hidden behind. Mine. No age omitted, no affiliations forged, no lie cushioning the truth. It stepped onto the stage in silence. The microphone hummed softly as I adjusted it. And then I began. I used to think death was the only thing you couldn't rewrite. But I was wrong. What we call death is just the moment the narrative loses control. What we call fate is just a draft left unedited. I told them everything about trauma that lives outside linear time, about the bending of grief, about identity as a non-linear phenomenon, and though I didn't say it, I spoke from the place inside me where the visions had once lived. I spoke from the empty chair in the hospital room that had waited 17 years for a name. And I filled it. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. Then applause. Not polite, not obligatory. Real. Warm. Complete. They clapped for me. For the real version. The one with cracked truths and frayed edges. The one who had survived herself. As I stepped down from the podium, I caught Rowan's eye in the crowd. He didn't smile. He nodded. And I felt something settle in my chest. Something not quite peaceful, but close. Later that night, I stood alone on the balcony of the hotel, the wind pulling at my hair, the city glittering like a page mid-turn. I closed my eyes. No vision came. Just the sound of my breath. Steady. unscripted. And I thought, maybe the real rebellion wasn't rewriting the ending. Maybe it was letting them love the version of me I hadn't met yet. The morning air tasted different. Not sweeter, not lighter, just real. Like the kind of air that doesn't wait for something to shatter. It moved through the curtains in gentle waves, ruffling the corners of the blanket draped over my knees, rustling the dried lavender in the glass jar on the windowsill. I sat on the edge of the bed, legs curled beneath me, hands wrapped around a single flickering candle. Its flame soft, undecided, not unlike me. My birthday has always come with a ritual. Not cake, not calls, not even silence from people who had long forgotten the day. It came with dread, with the quiet ticking of the hours as I waited for the same vision to steal into my bones and remind me how I was meant to die. This year, it didn't come. No flicker of fluorescent lights, no sterile ceiling, no mispronounced name echoing off white tile. Just this? Me, awake, whole, steady, watching the flame of a real candle in a room where my name existed on real mail, real notebooks, real skin. I exhaled slowly. From the kitchen came the soft sound of ceramic on wood, and then the warmth of footsteps. A shadow lengthened across the floor before Rowan appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs. One chipped, one new. "You're up early," he said. "I wanted to see," I whispered. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't have to. He crossed the room in a few slow steps and handed me the chipped mug, the one I always pretended I didn't prefer. Coffee. Too strong, slightly bitter, exactly how I liked it. I took a sip, still cradling the candle's warmth in my other hand. Then I looked at him. "Do you know what this means?" He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. "It means you're writing forward now." That sentence, it should broken me, or overwhelmed me, or made me run. But it didn't. It landed gently, like a hand on the shoulder of the girl I used to be, the one who erased her name before anyone else could, the one who lived out of order to survive the illusion of a fate she never chose, the one who believed disappearing was safer than being seen. But I wasn't her anymore. I had been found, not by someone else, but by my own decision to stay. I set the candle on the windowsill, its flame still dancing. For a moment, I thought about the girl I was at 17, cutting ties before they could tighten, declining scholarships like they were traps, performing brilliance as a form of hiding. I wanted to hold her, or maybe just whisper that it was okay, that she didn't fail for being scared, that she was allowed to rewrite, to revise, to live. I didn't return to the spotlight after the symposium. Not because I was ashamed, because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Instead, I stayed, quietly, offstage. I took a fellowship not with a title, but as a mentor. I began working with girls who reminded me of shadows I used to be, brilliant but silent, afraid of their own narratives, erasing themselves before the world could. We didn't talk about fate, we talked about authorship, about how sometimes reclaiming your voice doesn't look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like whispering something so true it rewrites the bones of your story. I watched them unfold, like pages that had always been there but were finally read. And in them, I found a version of myself I hadn't met yet, one that didn't exist to resist death, but to reclaim life on her own rhythm. Rowan stayed too. He never asked me to promise permanence. He never tried to hold me still. He just met me where I was, every day, like a comma instead of a period. Sometimes, we didn't speak for hours. Sometimes, we sat on the floor of the library, reading old notes and laughing at theories we once thought were gospel. And sometimes, in the quiet between dusk and dark, he would reach for my hand, not like he was trying to ground me, but like he was saying, "Thank you for still being here." I no longer waited for visions. I wrote poems in the margins of books. I taught my students how to question the way time moves, how to believe in the power of unordered memory. I let people say my name, Not the borrowed one, not the safe one. Mine. 'Cause I didn't need the inn anymore. The middle is where I found my name. And maybe the middle is the real miracle, the place where the story breathes instead of closes, where nothing is finished but everything begins again. So now, every year on my birthday, I light a candle, not to ward off a vision, but to welcome the absence of it. To honor the space that once tried to erase me and now makes room for me to write. And I think they said I was born quiet, but I was born knowing. And now I live like the story was never finished. 'Cause it wasn't. This story isn't just about breaking fate, it's about reclaiming authorship, about choosing to be known even when it's terrifying. We learn that sometimes the most powerful rebellion is not disappearing. It's letting yourself exist fully in the middle, before the ending, with no explanation owed. So here's the question. If no one could erase you, who would you finally allow yourself to become? Tell us in the comments, then hit subscribe because the next story might be the one where you stop running too.